In the end, the man who called himself the sun rotted from the inside out. Versailles shimmered like gold, but beneath the perfume, it smelled like infection. Power couldn't save him. Perfume couldn't hide him. And for once, the courtiers really did hold their breath. This is the story of Louis XIV, the king who believed he was chosen by God, who made his every breath a performance, and turned his palace into a glittering cage of mirrors. For more than 70 years, France revolved around him like planets around a star. But when the light began to fade, no one dared admit it. He died as he lived, magnificent, decaying, and observed by everyone. The Sun King, dimmed by gangrene, surrounded by people too polite to faint. You're already here, listening longer than most people would. So if you want this strange, rotting world to keep you company again, subscribe, or the algorithm will bury this channel deeper than Louis XIV's coffin. What time is it where you are? Tell me in the comments below. Versailles had its own clock, a golden one that stopped ticking the day he died. But before then, let's go back to the moment the light first appeared. If you were born in 1638, your chances of survival weren't exactly impressive. France was crawling with famine, superstition, and a monarchy that was running out of both heirs and patience. But then, after 22 long years of royal barrenness, a miracle happened. Or so they said. Anne of Austria, Queen of France and long-suffering wife to King Louis XIV, finally gave birth to a boy. Courtiers called him Dieu donné, God-given. It had a nice ring to it, mostly because nobody dared suggest otherwise. For 2 decades, the royal court had whispered that the king's marriage was cursed, or worse, celibate. The sudden arrival of a healthy infant was treated as divine proof that heaven still had France on speed dial. You can almost imagine the noise that filled the palace, bells ringing across Paris, priests fainting from excitement, nobles already calculating how to flatter a baby. France had a new prince, a living insurance policy for a fragile dynasty. But the king? He didn't live to enjoy it. When Louis XIV was only 4, his father died, leaving behind a country deep in debt, a nobility that resented being ignored, and a very determined queen who had no intention of letting anyone else raise her son. Anne of Austria became regent, ruling in her child's name, and immediately surrounded herself with the man history would quietly label her real partner in power, Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin was the Italian import nobody asked for, shrewd, perfumed, suspiciously well-dressed. He tutored young Louis in the art of survival, not through kindness but calculation. From him, the boy learned that power was a performance. A smile could disarm an enemy faster than a sword. And trust? Trust was a luxury for peasants. You can picture the child pacing marble halls lined with paintings of ancestors, each staring down with the expression of people who had never been told no. Servants bowed every few steps. Tutors hovered like ghosts. Even his toys were symbolic. Miniature cannons, tiny swords, a dollhouse version of France's military ambition. For all the silk and ceremony, Louis grew up in a kingdom on the edge of collapse. The people were starving. The nobles were plotting. The church was nervous. Paris itself smelled like despair mixed with sewage and bad wine. And somewhere in the middle of it, a small boy was being told he represented God. It's hard to imagine a more dangerous childhood. Then came the Fronde. The Fronde was a rebellion of nobles and magistrates, people who were tired of royal taxes and even more tired of Mazarin's smug face. They rose up against the crown, plunging France into civil chaos. Louis was only 10, and yet he found himself living in a kind of royal hostage crisis. One winter night, rebels broke into the royal palace. They stormed through corridors and demanded to see the child king, to make sure he hadn't been spirited away. So the boy was dragged from his bed, still half asleep, and displayed like a sacred relic. The mob stared down at the small figure in lace and velvet, blinking in candlelight. He was quiet, terrified perhaps, but he learned something vital that night. France loved its kings, but not enough to obey them. The palace walls reeked of fear and damp stone. Outside, the smell of gunpowder and unwashed soldiers filled the streets. For the rest of his life, Louis XIV would never forget that smell. He would later build Versailles to drown it out, to cover the memory with perfume and fountains. But that night, in the cold corridors of Paris, the idea was planted. If you can't control love, control obedience. Eventually, the Fronde collapsed. Mazarin returned from exile. Order was restored. But something inside the young king had hardened. He no longer saw the nobility as glamorous companions, only as potential traitors wearing powdered wigs. When he was 12, he wrote in his private notes, "The state is myself." Historians debate whether he actually meant it literally, but honestly, he lived as if he did. By the time he was crowned at Reims Cathedral in 1654, Louis XIV was 15, barely old enough to grow a mustache, but already fluent in ceremony. The coronation wasn't just a blessing, it was theater. Every movement was rehearsed, every symbol weighed down with meaning. He knelt for anointing with holy oil said to have descended from heaven centuries ago. Trumpets blared, the crowd wept. But what struck him most wasn't the sound, it was the obedience. Thousands of faces bent toward him in synchronized reverence, and he realized something intoxicating. They wanted to be ruled. They needed him to stand above them, to tell them what to worship. If you were him, how could you ever go back to being ordinary? That coronation was the moment a child became a deity in training. From then on, every gesture mattered. Every sunrise was his stage cue. He learned to walk slowly, to pause dramatically, to let the light hit his jeweled cuffs at just the right angle. Even eating was ritualized, the grand couvert, a royal dinner performed in front of hundreds of silent onlookers. He became an actor so committed to his role that he forgot where the mask ended. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Louis XIV never had a private self. There was no room for it. The boy who'd been dragged from his bed during the Fronde learned that safety came only from display. If you could keep everyone watching, they couldn't plot. So he built his world like a play. Every noble assigned a role, every hallway a backdrop. Versailles was the set piece that would ensure the performance never stopped. But that's for later. For now, you're still in that dim cathedral, watching a teenager crowned beneath the glare of divine oil. The incense burns thick. The choir trembles on a single note that seems to last forever. France is kneeling. The boy looks out over the crowd, and for the first time he smiles. Not like a child, but like someone who knows what it feels like to be worshipped. And somewhere, deep inside, a small voice whispers, "Never let them see you weak again." That whisper would guide him through wars, palaces, and decades of splendor, until it followed him to the sickbed, where his body finally betrayed him. Right now, he's still the miracle child, Dieudonné, the divine gift. And France is too dazzled to notice that the gift has already begun to believe he's God. Imagine you're Louis XIV, 20-something, freshly crowned, and very aware that your nobles hate you just a little less than they hate paying taxes. They smile, they bow, and they gossip about your every move the second you turn around. You've learned this the hard way, from rebellion, from betrayal, and from childhood nights spent listening to mobs outside your window. So, what do? You build a house so large, so blindingly magnificent, that no one dares look away. That house would become Versailles, not the romantic fairy tale version you see in postcards, the one dripping with chandeliers and pastel ceilings. No, in the beginning, it was a swamp. A literal swamp. The air was heavy with mosquitoes and mud. The ground swallowed your boots whole. Engineers begged him to reconsider. But Louis XIV wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for control. He chose Versailles for its isolation, far from the city, far from the smell of rebellion. Paris had too many memories of frightened kings and restless mobs. Versailles, on the other hand, was empty. Nobody lived there. Nobody wanted to, which made it perfect. If Paris was a city of people, Versailles would be a city of mirrors, a place where everything reflected him. You can almost see him standing on the damp, uneven earth, hands clasped behind his back, imagining the future. Fountains spraying in perfect rhythm, avenues radiating like sunbeams, nobles trapped in an endless orbit around his ego. And slowly, the mud began to turn to marble. The first stones were laid in 1661, just after the death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Louis was 22, and for the first time in his life, nobody stood between him and absolute power. It was a dangerous thing. Freedom in the hands of a man who'd never been told no. He summoned the greatest architects in France, Louis Le Vau for the structure, André Le Nôtre for the gardens, and Charles Lebrun for the art that would drape every ceiling and corridor. He didn't want a palace. He wanted a theology, something that said, I am the center of the world, and you orbit me whether you like it or not. And orbit they did. At its height, Versailles housed more than 10,000 people, courtiers, servants, soldiers, musicians, tailors, cooks, and even the people who cleaned the wigs of the people who cleaned the wigs. Nobles abandoned their ancestral estates to live there, spending fortunes on clothes and favors just to stand a little closer to the king's chair. The result? The most beautiful surveillance system in history. Every corridor was a spyglass, every wall an echo chamber. If you whispered something at dinner, someone 2 rooms away probably heard it. If you didn't show up to a royal ballet, Louis noticed. If you frowned during his meal, someone reported it. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a laboratory of obedience. You couldn't even wake up without participating in a ritual. At dawn, the king's servants opened his curtains to the music of trumpets. Nobles lined up to watch him rise, each movement choreographed like a sacred dance. You could spend years at court and still never be allowed to hand him his shirt. That privilege alone could determine your entire career. It was genius, really. He didn't have to kill his rivals. He just made them compete for the privilege of standing near him. You, for instance. If you were a duke, you might spend your morning practicing how to bow correctly. Too shallow, and you looked rude. Too deep, and you looked desperate. If you were lucky, you'd be allowed to hold a candle while the king prayed. That candle might cost you more than a year's income, but it was worth it, because he looked at you for half a second. That's what power looked like under Louis XIV. 1,000 grown men reduced to anxious schoolchildren waiting for a glance. The palace itself reflected that anxiety. Its architecture wasn't built for comfort. It was built for observation. Long, symmetrical corridors forced everyone to pass through the same spaces, the same audiences, the same watchful eyes. There was no privacy, only performance. The mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors weren't decoration. They were surveillance devices made of glass. And while everyone was busy watching him, he was watching everyone else. He designed the gardens to stretch endlessly from his window, not for beauty, but so he could see who approached. The geometry of the hedges was the geometry of discipline, straight, precise, unyielding. Even the fountains obeyed a schedule. When the king went for a walk, servants turned them on in sequence, one after another, so that no water was wasted when he wasn't looking. It was efficient tyranny disguised as elegance. And the nobles? They loved it, or at least they pretended to, because leaving Versailles meant obscurity. Staying meant ruinous expenses, debt, and humiliation. But at least you existed in the Sun King's light. Bit by bit, Louis turned aristocrats into ornaments. Their job was to sparkle, not to think. Their fortunes evaporated in lace and wine. By the 1670s, most were financially dependent on the crown, trapped in a beautiful golden cage. You could call it politics. He called it etiquette. He had built an empire of obedience on the foundations of fear. Not the loud kind, not soldiers and swords, but the quiet fear of being ignored, of not being invited to the next masquerade, of being forgotten in the endless corridors of Versailles. There's a strange serenity in that, isn't there? The whole court moving like clockwork, all to keep one man amused. And yet, if you stood in the middle of it, in the grand courtyard, surrounded by white stone and trumpet fanfares, you might feel something else beneath the grandeur. You might feel the stillness. The air doesn't move at Versailles. The symmetry is so perfect it feels unnatural, like the palace itself is holding its breath. That's the thing about perfection. It's sterile. And Versailles, for all its golden gardens, was a sterile world built on paranoia. Louis XIV didn't just build a palace. He built a stage set for eternity. Every window aligned to catch the sunrise. Every hall arranged so that his image appeared infinite. Even the furniture was placed according to his preference, not for comfort, but for optics. The irony, of course, is that the palace designed to project eternal power would one day become a mausoleum of dust and silence. The mirrors would tarnish, the fountains would dry, and the same halls that once echoed with royal laughter would reek of mold and emptiness. But for now, the performance is flawless. The nobles are still dancing, the fountains still obedient, and the king still radiant in his own reflection. You can almost hear his footsteps down the marble hall, slow, deliberate. Every tap of his heel a reminder that this world was built to orbit him. And somewhere in the distance, under all the gold and ceremony, the swamp is still there, buried, but not gone. The ground remembers, because no matter how much perfume you pour over fear, eventually, it starts to smell again. If you woke up at Versailles, you didn't wake up. You performed awakening. The day began not with sunlight, but with ceremony. At precisely 8:30 each morning, the curtains around the royal bed parted to reveal the king. Not by accident, not by affection, but by appointment. Everything at Versailles ran on a schedule, and nothing was more sacred than the lever du roi, the king's rising. Now imagine this. You're Louis XIV, lying in a bed so large it has its own zip code. Gold-threaded sheets, silk pillows embroidered with suns. Outside your chamber, A small army of nobles waits, dressed, powdered, perfumed, all for the privilege of watching you open your eyes. It wasn't enough to rule France. You also had to make it look impressive. The first entrance was granted to a handful of very important men, dukes, bishops, and ministers who shuffled in like priests entering a temple. They murmured greetings, bowed deeply, and watched as the royal doctors checked your pulse. Then came the grand entrance, where a second, larger wave of courtiers entered, each one praying to be noticed while you pretended not to. One noble handed you your wig, another your shirt. Someone else held the candle. Another poured water over your hands. Each role was a battlefield of privilege, a silent war fought with lace and smiles. If you ever think your office politics are bad, imagine competing to hand your boss a sock. The chosen one, the Grand Chambellan, had the honor of presenting the royal stockings. It sounds trivial, but it was everything. To dress the king was to share his divinity for a brief moment. Those silk stockings were political currency. They could ruin you or raise you. Meanwhile, the unlucky majority stood in the back, sweating quietly under their wigs, pretending they enjoyed being ignored. If they sneezed, they were escorted out. From the moment he sat up, Louis XIV became a living symbol. Each movement rehearsed, each word controlled. He greeted his son with the serene nod of a man greeting his reflection. A valet dabbed rosewater on his hands. Perfume drifted through the chamber, masking the less poetic odors of humanity. And you, if you were lucky enough to stand in that perfumed crowd, you'd feel your heartbeat sink to his gestures. When he yawned, people smiled. When he frowned, they panicked. The king was the weather system of Versailles. Every emotion radiated outward. Once dressed, Louis made his way through the gilded corridors to the chapel for morning mass. The echo of his heels on the marble was like a metronome. Click, 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 the rhythm of divine authority. The courtiers followed in perfect silence, their footsteps muffled by velvet. Every head bowed at the exact same angle as the royal profile passed by. You didn't walk near the king. You orbited him. After Mass came the Council of State, where ministers gathered to pretend they still mattered. The king would sit beneath a painting of himself as Apollo, sunlight filtering through the windows to highlight his face. Because, of course, the architects had aligned the building for that exact effect. Then, around 1 o'clock, came the most famous performance of all, Le Grand Couvert, the public meal. The royal dining hall was not a room for eating. It was a theater for submission. Hundreds gathered just to watch the king chew. Imagine the silence, the only sounds, the scrape of silverware and the faint rustle of silk skirts. Louis dined in public several times a week, seated beneath a canopy embroidered with golden suns. His wife, his children, and selected nobles stood at a distance, as if attending a sacred ritual rather than lunch. Every dish arrived in procession: soups, meats, pastries, wines, each announced like a sermon. No one spoke to him unless spoken to. Even his family addressed him as sire. You might think it strange to eat while a few hundred people stare at you, but Louis didn't. To him, visibility was oxygen. The more eyes upon him, the more real he became. It wasn't vanity. It was strategy. Power, he had learned, wasn't something you possessed. It was something you performed. And in this performance, nothing could go wrong. If a dish was too cold, the cook risked exile. If a servant tripped, he vanished by the next sunrise. The courtiers stood motionless, careful not to sigh too loudly, each one trying to look appropriately awed by the way His Majesty lifted a spoon. You could almost hear the collective inhale as he brought it to his lips. History held its breath over a mouthful of soup. After lunch came the promenade, the royal walk through the gardens. There the king moved through his own creation, every fountain, every hedge trimmed to mirror his geometry. The nobles trailed behind like a flock of jeweled shadows, murmuring praise, their laughter soft and artificial. You might think the sunlight was too bright, but that was intentional. He was the Sun King, after all. By evening, the ritual began to reverse. The coucher du roi, the royal bedtime. At precisely 10 o'clock, the same ceremony that began the day began again in reverse. The nobles returned, still perfumed, still obedient, to watch their monarch go to bed. The candles burned low, curtains closed. The royal body was undressed piece by piece, wig, shoes, stockings, rings, until only the man remained, pale and human, if only for a moment. Those permitted to witness it pretended not to notice. After all, even kings must sleep. And you, standing there, in your satin and lace, would bow again, because to leave before the final bow would be an insult. You'd step backward slowly, careful not to turn your back on the royal bed, because even his dreams were sacred. The doors closed. The courtiers dispersed like moths escaping the light. The palace exhaled, 1,000 footsteps fading into silence. But inside that chamber, Louis XIV lay awake, the flicker of candlelight trembling on the canopy above him. The rituals had ended, but he could never escape them. For even in darkness, he was expected to shine. He had become the prisoner of his own perfection, a captive god whose kingdom revolved on a clock wound by fear and admiration. Tomorrow, it would all begin again. The same curtains, the same bows, the same stockings, the same breathless awe. And somewhere deep in the walls of Versailles, in the stillness between one ritual and the next, you can almost hear the palace sigh, a quiet sound of exhaustion from a place that never sleeps. Because when you build a world where everything revolves around one man, you eventually trap him in it. Louis XIV may have ruled France, but Versailles ruled him. And if you've made it this far, you already know what it feels like to be caught inside someone else's masterpiece, still listening while everyone else has looked away. So go on, subscribe. Don't let this story vanish into the silence that swallowed the Sun King. If you've ever looked at a painting of Versailles, the shimmering gold, the marble, the perfect symmetry, you might imagine it smelled like heaven. Roses in the gardens, beeswax candles, maybe a hint of lavender drifting through the halls. It didn't. It smelled like people, thousands of them, unwashed, perfumed, powdered people. Versailles was a palace without plumbing, a masterpiece without drains. When Louis XIV ordered it built, engineers warned him about the swampy ground and the lack of water systems. The king, of course, wasn't interested in practicalities. He wanted spectacle. Toilets were not spectacular. So instead, courtiers relieved themselves wherever convenience and etiquette intersected, which was to say behind curtains, under staircases, and most famously behind the grand tapestries that lined the walls. The tapestries absorbed everything: heat, gossip, and bodily decisions best left unspoken. And yet, every morning, servants sprinkled herbs and flower petals on the floors to freshen the air, which is a little like spraying perfume on a corpse and calling it alive. By the 1670s, the royal court had discovered a solution. Ignore it. Or better, cover it. Thus began the great age of perfume. Perfume wasn't just decoration at Versailles. It was survival. The air was so thick with odor that people carried scented handkerchiefs to avoid fainting. The perfumers of Paris, known as the Gantier parfumeurs, became indispensable to royal life. They mixed concoctions of ambergris, civet, jasmine, and musk, strong enough to stun a small mammal. Louis XIV adored scent. He preferred orange blossom, rose water, and the faint sweetness of jasmine oil. His daily routine involved an almost alchemical layering of fragrance: perfumed gloves, perfumed shirts, even perfumed wigs. His courtiers followed suit, and soon Versailles smelled like a flower shop having an argument with a sewer. If you had walked the marble halls in 1680, you'd have been greeted by a wall of scent so thick it felt solid: honey and rot, wine and wax, crushed petals, and human heat. And yet, no one complained, not openly, because scent was status. The poorer you were, the worse you smelled. The rich simply drowned their problems in roses. Of course, not everyone handled this elegantly. Powdered wigs, for instance, weren't a fashion choice. They were a truce with nature. When Louis XIV began to lose his hair in his early 30s, he turned to wigs to maintain his divine image. A bald sun king simply wouldn't do. His court immediately followed. Before long, every nobleman at Versailles had a mountain of horsehair balanced on his skull, dusted with perfumed powder that rained down like dandruff made of regret. The powder was meant to whiten the hair, hide grease, and mask lice. The irony, of course, is that the powder also attracted lice, which meant that underneath those grand, perfumed towers of curls lived small civilizations of parasites, entire colonies of Versailles wildlife, busy with their own version of court politics. And still, the nobles smiled, bowed, and adjusted their wigs as if nothing was wrong. You, if you'd been there, might have tried to breathe through your mouth. The air was heavy with sweat and cinnamon, smoke and candle wax. Hundreds of oil lamps burned through the night, releasing a constant haze of soot. The wax dripped, the perfumes mixed, and the heat made everything worse. Versailles was beautiful, yes, but it was also sticky. The walls trapped humidity like a greenhouse. Fabrics never quite dried. Servants beat the curtains daily to keep mold from growing on the brocade. And everywhere you went, there was someone trying to sweep, scrub, or disguise the inevitable. At dinner, guests sat elbow to elbow under chandeliers dripping with wax, surrounded by food that spoiled within hours. Meat sweated in the heat. Fish, brought in from Paris, arrived already halfway to its afterlife. The sweet smell of pastries mingled with the sharp sting of vinegar used to clean silverware. The result was something no perfume could fix. So they tried more. More incense, more lavender water, more scented gloves and sachets stuffed into corsets. Some nobles even trained small dogs to carry perfume satchels around their necks, as if canine aromatherapy might improve the air quality. It didn't. Every few years, a doctor would nervously suggest that perhaps hygiene, real hygiene, might help. Louis XIV would nod politely and then commission a new fountain. After all, nothing distracts from the smell of rot, quite like the sound of splashing water. The king himself bathed rarely, perhaps twice a year, and even then under protest. Physicians at the time believed water could open the pores and let in disease. Cleanliness, they argued, was a spiritual condition, not a physical one. So people changed their linens instead. Sheets were considered a kind of dry bath. If your linens were clean, surely you were too. You can almost hear the grumpy historian muttering now. They thought sunlight and soap were rival ideologies. But to Louis, this wasn't madness. It was logic. The Sun King's body wasn't supposed to be mortal. It was sacred, divine, anointed. Water was for peasants. perfume was for gods, and yet for all the effort, the palace still stank. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about it, politely of course, describing the overpowering blend of roses and decay. Some said the smell lingered in their clothes for weeks. Others admitted that the gardens smelled sweeter because they were the only place the wind could reach. Still, the court adored it. The scent of Versailles was part of its identity, a perfumed mask over the rot, a metaphor for France itself, elegant, magnificent, and quietly decomposing beneath the lace. If you'd walked through those halls, you'd notice the contradictions everywhere. Sunlight bouncing off gold leaf, while shadows hid chamber pots. Laughter echoing through rooms where servants scrubbed the floors with vinegar. The illusion of paradise maintained by sheer perfumed willpower. And yet, that illusion worked. For decades, Europe believed the myth that Versailles was heaven on earth, that France was the center of beauty and grace. And all the while, the palace was quietly fermenting beneath its own perfection. One day, centuries later, when restorers began cleaning the walls of the royal apartments, they found layers of grime built up so thick that beneath the paint, the plaster had turned black. It turns out perfume doesn't erase history. It only slows it down. So the next time you see Versailles glimmering under the French sun, remember, it was never as clean as it looked. Behind the gold and mirrors, it smelled like fear, sweat, and ambition. The human scent of a god pretending not to be human at all. And beneath all the roses, the swamp was still there. There are monarchs who go to war because they must, and then there was Louis XIV, a man who went to war because peace was boring. To him, war wasn't chaos. It was theater. Armies were his actors, the continent his stage, and every battle a carefully choreographed ballet of banners, cannons, and glory. He didn't see mud or blood or starvation. He saw the reflection of himself in every polished musket and gilded standard. If you'd stood beside him in his youth, you might have believed it too. The young Sun King was radiant in armor, jeweled sword, plumed helmet, the faint scent of orange blossom even on campaign. He didn't fight, of course. That was for lesser mortals. But he watched magnificently. And so he began the first of his great performances, wars so long and expensive that France would spend generations paying for them. The War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the War of the Reunions, the War of the League of Augsburg, the War of Spanish Succession. If you're hearing a pattern, that's because there was one. Louis XIV declared war about as often as most people change their wigs. Each campaign began with fanfare, a glorious declaration of divine purpose, and ended with fields of corpses, bankrupt treasuries, and peasants eating grass. But for Louis, it was worth it. Every victory parade fed the illusion that he truly was the Sun King, the divine hand of order moving across Europe's chessboard. When his troops marched into foreign cities, they carried his emblems embroidered with suns, rays, and Latin mottos about destiny. Even destruction had branding. And like any showman, Louis hated an unfinished act. He needed applause. So even when peace treaties were signed, he immediately began preparing for the next war. Because what's the point of being eternal if no one's watching? You can almost picture him pacing through the hall of mirrors, his reflection repeating endlessly behind him. 50 Louis XIVs staring back, each one silently demanding another victory. But while the king dreamed of glory, the kingdom dreamed of bread. Wars devoured the treasury. Taxes multiplied like rabbits. Farmers were forced to hand over grain, horses, and sons. When famine struck in the 1690s, whole provinces starved while the court continued its rituals, powdered, perfumed, and oblivious. By candlelight, Louis read battle reports describing the heroic advance of his armies through regions where even the rats had disappeared. He nodded gravely, murmured prayers for victory, and reached for another piece of candied fruit. Because that was how he coped: sugar and ceremony. Louis XIV had the diet of a man trying to out-eat mortality itself. His feasts were legendary: mountains of meat, endless soups, roasted game birds, cream pastries, and gallons of wine. Dinner wasn't just nourishment, it was proof of life. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, a declaration that he could consume the world and never be consumed in return. But the body always rebels eventually, even against a king. By his 50s, the royal digestion had begun a quiet revolution. His teeth, once white and orderly, turned black and crumbling. The dentists of the day did their best, which is to say they made it worse. They extracted tooth after tooth until his jaw sagged and his words slurred. Eating became an ordeal, though he refused to admit it. You would have seen him at those endless dinners, forcing smiles as he chewed on pain, surrounded by nobles pretending not to notice the faint sound of cracking enamel. The smell of rot was masked, as always, with perfume. The court physicians, meanwhile, took detailed notes. They called it divine appetite, an expression of the king's heavenly vigor. His constant feasting, they said, kept the royal humors in balance. His physicians bled him regularly, prescribed purgatives, and congratulated themselves on maintaining the health of France's most important stomach. It never occurred to them that the humors were killing him. If you were at Versailles then, you'd notice the pattern. Every time war strained the kingdom, the king's appetite grew. The more Europe bled, the more he ate. His banquets became an act of denial, a way to pretend that the body of France was as invincible as his own. And yet, behind the golden curtains, his country was rotting faster than his teeth. Villages disappeared from maps. Fields lay abandoned. Roads filled with beggars. Veterans with missing limbs. Widows carrying their children in baskets. Priests praying for rain while soldiers looted their churches. But none of that reached the Sun King's table. Courtiers made sure of it. They spoke only of victories, of glory, of how the name Louis inspired trembling in every foreign court. They never mentioned that the trembling at home came from hunger. Still, war suited him. It gave structure to his myth. Even as the decades passed and the campaigns grew smaller, slower, more desperate, he clung to them. Each one a new act in the grand performance of divine destiny. But there was a price. By the time he reached 70, the glorious conquests had become defensive wars, a struggle to hold on to a kingdom buckling under its own weight. The soldiers were exhausted, the nobles were bankrupt, and the people had begun whispering that maybe, just maybe, God had found someone else to bless. And Louis himself? He was shrinking, not in title, but in flesh. The gluttony that once symbolized strength had turned to pain. He was still eating, still smiling for the court. But each swallow came with the taste of iron. If you leaned close enough during one of those royal dinners, past the silver plates and gilded goblets, you might have caught a glimpse of the truth. The world's most powerful man grimacing as he chewed, one hand hidden under the table, pressing against his stomach. But of course no one mentioned it. To suggest the king was unwell was treasonous, almost blasphemous. Instead, they praised his divine endurance. Ministers compared him to Hercules, poets called him the living Apollo, and the perfumers simply made stronger sense. You can almost feel the absurdity of it all. The court dining like deities while their empire crumbled. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers glittered, and somewhere outside, another village burned to the ground. Louis XIV believed he was feeding France, but really, France was feeding him. Every loaf of bread taxed from a peasant's table, every coin wrung from the countryside, all of it ended up on his plate. It was a kind of slow national cannibalism, the kingdom consuming itself to keep its son alive. And for a while, it worked. The wars continued, the banquets continued, the myth endured. Until one day the fires went out, the music quieted, and the only sound left in the Hall of Mirrors was the echo of his own chewing. The Sun King, the man who once ate Europe alive, now found his body rebelling from within. His jaw ached, his breath reeked of infection, and his once glorious appetite had become the beginning of his undoing. But that's the problem with divine hunger. Eventually, it consumes you too. For most kings, the body is private. For Louis XIV, it was France. Every breath, every heartbeat, every royal sneeze carried political weight. When he ate, the nation feasted. When he limped, the kingdom winced. His body was not flesh. It was theology wrapped in lace. The Sun King believed himself chosen by God, a walking covenant between heaven and earth. And so, his health became a kind of sacred weather. When he smiled, France prospered. When he coughed, ministers whispered prayers. The church, of course, approved. A divine king made for excellent sermons. Priests proclaimed that Louis's body was the vessel of grace, his endurance proof of celestial favor. If he bled, it was interpreted as sacrifice. If he sneezed during Mass, it was taken as a sign of divine irritation with the congregation. The Archbishop of Paris once said, without irony, that the kingdom exists within His Majesty's veins. It was all very poetic and completely absurd. But imagine being raised with that idea. Imagine every ache, every shiver, magnified by the belief that the fate of millions depends on your digestion. You'd become paranoid, wouldn't you? You'd start to see your reflection not as a face, but as a map of your empire. Every wrinkle a failing province, every tooth a fortress lost. And that's exactly what happened. As Louis XIV aged, the myth of his body began to betray him. It started with small things, stiffness in the joints, swelling in the feet. He ignored them, of course. Kings do not limp, but by his 60s he was suffering from gout, hemorrhoids, and a digestive system that seemed personally committed to rebellion. At court, these ailments became state secrets. Every twinge was disguised behind ceremony. During audiences, he stood perfectly still, even when his legs burned with pain. He never let the court see him wince, except once when he sneezed during a mass and a bishop fainted. You might laugh, but to them, that sneeze was cosmic. The king had moved, and therefore heaven had spoken. It sounds ridiculous now, but in a world built on divine symbolism, his body was scripture. Every mark, every ailment, every faltering step could be read like prophecy. And yet, the body didn't care. The royal physicians tried everything. Leeches, enemas, poultices, bleeding, and more enemas. Because in the 17th century, medicine was mostly about moving fluids in and out of royal bodies until they stopped complaining. Some days, the palace smelled not of perfume, but of vinegar and panic. The king's bowels became a matter of national concern. His hemorrhoids were whispered about like political scandals. His gout had its own schedule, its own courtiers, its own drama. Doctors debated whether his stomach pain came from divine melancholy or just too many candied plums. But no one dared suggest moderation. Moderation was for mortals. To Louis, control was everything. He had spent his entire life mastering movement, the art of walking, sitting, and even breathing in perfect rhythm. His body had been trained to obey the crown on his head. It was not supposed to revolt. But now, the divine machinery was rusting. He began to eat alone more often. His hands trembled as he signed decrees. The once smooth mask of the Sun King began to crack, not visibly, not yet, but in the subtle pauses between words. The courtiers noticed, though they pretended not to. They whispered in corridors, trading updates like market news. His Majesty's legs are inflamed again. The king had difficulty standing during vespers. The royal stomach is displeased. And because everything in Versailles was symbolic, his suffering took on a terrible poetry. When his legs swelled, France's armies faltered. When his stomach rebelled, the treasury emptied. When his breath came short, storms ruined the harvest. The kingdom's decline mirrored his anatomy, a slow, painful collapse disguised by ceremony. If you'd been a servant then, you might have noticed the silence that followed his footsteps. It wasn't reverence anymore. It was listening. Everyone listened. For the sound of pain, for a stumble, for the slightest sign that the divine machine was faltering. The irony is that Louis, who had spent his life controlling everyone else's bodies, where they stood, how they bowed, when they breathed, was now trapped inside a body that refused to obey him. He could command armies, but not his bladder. He could silence nobles, but not his joints. The king who once conquered Europe now measured his victories in the distance between his bed and his chair. Still, the performance continued. The morning lever, the evening coucher, the public meals, the endless bows, all repeated with exhausting precision, as if routine could hold decay at bay. He smiled when he needed to smile, feigned strength when he needed to appear immortal, and never, ever admitted defeat. Because if the sun admitted it was setting, what would happen to the world that revolved around it? That's the tragedy of divine kingship. You can never be human without destroying the illusion. But his body didn't care about illusions. It was done serving as a metaphor. Some days he would collapse into his chair after Mass, too weak to stand. Servants fanned him, doctors fussed, and courtiers pretended not to notice the blue tint of his lips. Once, when a physician asked about his pain, Louis replied, "It is only France that aches." He wasn't wrong. His pain was France's pain, not because heaven decreed it, but because he had built a system where the two were inseparable. His body was the state, and now both were failing in slow, exquisite unison. If you were there, watching him drag his swollen legs across the marble floors, the golden sunlight bouncing off his powdered wig, you might almost pity him. Almost. The man who once believed himself the embodiment of divine perfection had become a fragile vessel of mortal suffering. And yet, no one dared say it aloud. They bowed lower. They whispered prayers. They sprayed more perfume. Anything to avoid facing the truth that the kingdom's God was dying like a man. There's something darkly comic in that, isn't there? A lifetime spent turning pain into theater, only to realize that the final act writes itself. The divine body, once the symbol of control, had become the stage of collapse, and the courtiers, ever faithful, still applauded. Because in Versailles, even decay had choreography. There are many ways for a king to make history. Louis XIV chose one of the least glamorous by letting a surgeon slice him open in front of an audience, and doing it without a drop of anesthesia. It was 1686, and the Sun King was not shining. He had developed what doctors politely called a fistula, an infected abscess near his rear that made every movement, every bow, every attempt to sit through Mass a small act of torture. He couldn't ride, couldn't sleep, and could barely endure the daily rituals that defined his existence. The divine body, that sacred symbol of France itself, had become a source of ridicule whispered behind fans and fans of perfume. At first, his physicians did what 17th century physicians did best. They experimented. Hot compresses, herbal poultices, endless bleeding. Nothing worked. The infection deepened, the pain grew unbearable, and the court's fear of scandal matched his own fear of mortality. Because, of course, a king couldn't admit to suffering from something so embarrassingly human. How do you tell a kingdom that its god has an infected backside? You don't. You call it a divine inflammation. By autumn, the situation had become impossible to hide. The king winced when he sat, gripped the arms of his chair during council meetings, and began favoring one side when he walked. Courtiers pretended not to notice, though the silence was louder than any gossip. Eventually, there was no choice. The royal surgeons decided on an operation, an excruciating, experimental procedure to cut and drain the abscess. And because this was Louis XIV, it couldn't just happen quietly. It had to be an event. Word spread across Europe that the world's most powerful man was going under the knife. Nobles wrote prayers, poets composed verses, and churchmen debated whether God himself might steady the surgeon's hand. The day arrived, November 18th, 1686. Picture the scene. The king lies face down on a bed draped in linen, his golden wig removed, his silk garments replaced by a sheet. Around him, a half-circle of physicians, priests, and trembling courtiers watch in reverent horror. The room is thick with the smell of wine, sweat, and vinegar, the closest thing they had to sterilization. There is no anesthesia, no chloroform, no painkiller stronger than faith. The surgeon, Charles-François Félix, steps forward, the man who has spent months practicing on volunteers from the Parisian poor. Yes, actual test subjects. The city's surgeons performed trial runs on patients with similar ailments until they perfected the technique. A grotesque rehearsal for royal salvation. He bows deeply, lifts the scalpel, and begins. The first incision draws a sound from the king that no one present would ever forget. A low, strangled cry, not quite human, not quite divine. Then silence. The operation takes hours. Felix cuts, drains, and stitches. Assistants hold candles, sweat dripping down their faces. The courtiers stand motionless, afraid to breathe too loudly. The air smells of iron and damp cloth. When it's finally over, the surgeon steps back, pale and shaking. He bows again. The king, still trembling, forces out a whisper. Je souffre, mais je reste roi. I suffer, but I remain king. The room erupts, not in horror, but in applause. For weeks afterward, Versailles treats the event like a miracle. Masses are held in his honor. Commemorative medals are minted depicting the Sun King triumphing over disease. People sing hymns of thanksgiving. Foreign ambassadors send congratulations as if France had won another war. Never mind that it was an infected wound. At Versailles, everything was theater, even agony. Louis himself played the role perfectly. As soon as he could stand again, he made sure to appear before the court, walking slowly, stoically, his every step a performance of divine endurance. He praised the surgeon, smiled through the pain, and told visitors that the experience had strengthened his faith. He even commissioned paintings of his recovery, as if survival itself were another conquest. The king who once fought wars across Europe now fought bacteria, and won. The irony, of course, is that it wasn't courage that saved him. It was pride. He couldn't scream, couldn't faint, couldn't ask for mercy. Not because he didn't want to, but because France was watching. For a man whose identity depended on being untouchable, weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. You, if you'd been there, might have noticed the tremor in his fingers when he signed documents afterward, the slight hesitation when he lowered himself into a chair, the quiet wince that passed like a shadow across his face. He called it bravery. It was really endurance, the stubborn, exhausted determination to stay divine a little longer. The court called it a miracle, of course. Priests declared it proof that God still favored France. Perfume merchants even released new scents inspired by the purified body of the king. A fragrant reminder that holiness, like everything else in Versailles, could be bottled and sold. And because Versailles never wasted an opportunity for symbolism, the surgeon's tools were gilded and displayed like holy relics. Visitors whispered before them as though standing at an altar. But beneath all the gold and gratitude, the truth was much simpler. The operation worked because the man was too proud to die on schedule. For weeks afterward, the palace was alive with energy again. Dinners resumed, fountains danced, and music returned to the halls. The king smiled, stiffly, painfully, but the smile was enough. The performance continued. Still, something had changed. For the first time, the courtiers had seen the god bleed. The Sun King's divinity had been peeled back like silk from flesh. And though the wound healed, the illusion never quite did. From then on, Louis's body became both symbol and warning. A fragile empire stitched together with pride. He had survived his own dissection, yes, but the operation left a mark deeper than the scar itself. It proved what he'd never wanted anyone to admit, that the divine body could suffer, could rot, could reek like any other. And yet, he wore that pain like a crown. He transformed it into legend, a story of endurance so exaggerated that courtiers began describing it as the most elegant operation in human history. They said he barely flinched, that he smiled through the blood, that he thanked God before the surgeon. They forgot the muffled screams. They forgot the smell. Because in Versailles, remembering the truth was bad manners. You can almost imagine him afterward, alone in his chamber, candlelight flickering on the wall, his hand tracing the bandages, wondering how something so human could still hurt so much. For all his power, he was trapped. A man performing immortality in a body that refused to cooperate. And perhaps, in that silent moment after the pain, he understood it for the first time. His body was not the kingdom. It was just the stage, and the play wasn't over yet. By the dawn of the 1700s, the Sun King was still shining, but faintly, like a candle in a drafty church. The man who once dazzled Europe with wars and ballets now found his court quieter, his gardens bare, and his own reflection unrecognizable. The gold still gleamed, yes, but the light had changed. The sun had grown cold. Once, Versailles had been a furnace of life, a world of laughter, music, flirtation, and constant motion. But as Louis XIV aged, the palace took on a hush, like an old instrument played too long. The corridors echoed with slower footsteps, the fountains froze in the winters, and the smell of perfume had thinned to something faint and wistful. You can imagine it. The once sparkling halls lit by a few tired candles, their flames dancing weakly against the endless mirrors. Outside, the trees of the grand avenues stood skeletal against the gray French sky. The Sun King, who had built this world to reflect himself, now wandered through a monument to his own endurance. His glory had dimmed, and he knew it. The wars that once filled him with pride now filled his treasury with emptiness. The fields were barren, the peasants starving, and France, that kingdom he had shaped in his own image, was exhausted. Even his victories had begun to look suspiciously like losses. The War of Spanish Succession, his last great gamble, had dragged on for over a decade, draining lives and fortunes alike. France's borders barely changed, but the cost was ruinous. The soldiers who limped home were welcomed by hunger and taxes, not parades. At Versailles, the gossip had softened, not from respect, but from weariness. The courtiers still bowed, still smiled, still called him Your Majesty, but even their praise sounded tired. They spoke in whispers now, as if afraid to wake the past. The Sun King's family had begun to vanish one by one, his brother, his son, his grandsons, all gone before him. Death had become his most regular visitor, slipping quietly through the gilded halls. You can almost hear the echo of funeral drums muffled under layers of velvet. Each loss dimmed the palace further. Where once there were dancing lights and music, now there were chapels full of prayer. Where laughter once echoed, there were only sighs. And in the middle of it all, Louis XIV sat, the last survivor of his own dynasty, surrounded by ghosts and gold. His only real companion in those years was Madame de Maintenon, the governess who had become his secret wife. She wasn't young, or vain, or ambitious anymore. She was tired, and so was he. Every evening she sat by his side, whispering prayers while he coughed into his embroidered handkerchief. Their romance was no longer a scandal, but a comfort. Two weary souls sharing the same slow descent. Sometimes she would read to him from devotional books while the fire sputtered in the grate. Outside, the frost crept across the gardens, covering the statues and fountains in sheets of ice. Versailles, once the palace of eternal summer, had become a mausoleum for sunlight. Even the courtiers began to dress darker, move slower, speak softer. It was as if the entire court had entered mourning before the king had died. And beyond those gilded gates, a different kind of dawn was rising, one that no amount of perfume or pageantry could hold back. In Paris, in salons and coffee houses, a new kind of conversation had begun, one that questioned everything Louis stood for. Philosophers were whispering heresies wrapped in politeness, reason over ritual, progress over privilege, humanity over hierarchy. The Enlightenment was stirring, and Versailles could feel it like a draft under a locked door. Louis, of course, ignored it. He believed the world would end with him, and in a way it would. The old world, the one built on ceremony and divine right, was already cracking beneath the weight of its own luxury. Inside the palace, the mirrors reflected nothing but the past. The light was still beautiful, but it was borrowed, the final shimmer before darkness. You might picture him in those last winters, the once golden monarch wrapped in heavy brocade, seated by the fire, hands trembling as he warms them over the flames. The courtiers stand at a distance, waiting, as they always have. But there's no music now, no laughter, no flirtation, only the slow breathing of a man who has outlived his own glory. He still attended Mass every morning, still signed decrees, still dined in public, because ritual was the only thing left to him. The machinery of kingship had to keep moving, even if the man inside it was breaking down. Madame de Maintenon sometimes begged him to rest. "You are tired, sire," she would whisper. "France can wait." But France was him. He couldn't stop without ending everything. And so he kept performing, slower, thinner, but never silent. Even his coughs became part of the act. When he smiled through pain, the courtiers praised his fortitude. When he prayed, they called it devotion. But really, it was habit. The body moved on instinct, long after belief had faded. The Sun King's twilight was not a blaze of glory, but a long, flickering candle, elegant, stubborn, and quietly tragic. If you had been there in those final winters, you'd have seen how even the palace itself seemed to age with him. The gold leaf dulled. The fountains froze. The air grew heavy with wax and memory. The laughter that once shook the walls had become a faint hum, a kind of haunted music played only for those who remembered when the sun still burned. And perhaps that's the strangest thing about Louis XIV's decline. He never stopped being majestic. Even in decay, he was beautiful. The king who once dazzled the world was now a fragile monument to his own legend, pale, coughing, haloed by candlelight. Versailles, his great mirror, reflected him exactly as he was, magnificent and mortal at the same time. He had become what he'd always wanted to be, an image, eternal, unchanging, untouchable. But the light was fading fast, and outside, in the cold air beyond the palace gates, a new world was waiting, impatient, curious, and unafraid of gods. So before this story joins him in the dark, subscribe, or let the last light of Versailles die unseen. By August of 1715, the Sun King was 80 years old, older than any monarch in Europe, older than most of his subjects ever lived to be. He had outlasted his enemies, his heirs, and nearly every superstition about divine right. He had turned himself into living mythology, but now mythology was limping. It began as a pain in his left leg, a dull, persistent ache, nothing worth interrupting a performance for. After all, Louis XIV had endured worse: wars, surgery, gout, and the slow betrayal of every bone in his body. A little leg pain was nothing to a man who had spent half a century pretending to be immortal. The royal physicians, ever eager to flatter their patient, told him it was a touch of sciatica. That sounded noble enough, the sort of discomfort a king might suffer from sitting too long on thrones. They prescribed rest, massages, and warm cloths soaked in wine. Wine, the universal 17th century solution. But the pain didn't fade. It sharpened. It began to pulse. The leg swelled. The skin darkened. And at night, the king could feel the heartbeat of something deep and malignant inside the flesh. He didn't say a word, because kings don't confess to decay. Instead, Louis carried on, walking slowly, leaning discreetly on a cane, determined that the world should never see weakness written on his body. The court followed his lead, pretending not to notice that the sun was beginning to limp. Even as infection spread under his velvet stockings, the king still insisted on his rituals. He dined publicly, smiled politely, attended councils, and endured the rising tide of pain with a kind of grim theatricality. It was as though the body itself were an uncooperative actor, and he, the eternal director, refused to let it ruin the show. Then came the Persian ambassador. That August, A delegation from the Persian Empire arrived at Versailles, bearing gifts and promises of alliance. It was meant to be one last great moment of spectacle, a glittering audience in which the King of France would receive foreign envoys as though they had traveled not across continents, but up Mount Olympus. Louis could barely stand. But appearances were everything. He ordered himself dressed in full regalia, gold-embroidered coat, white stockings, the heavy jeweled sword that had once made him look invincible. The courtiers helped him into his shoes, wincing as he stifled a groan. When they asked if he wished to postpone the audience, he replied simply, "No. Kings do not rest." The Persian ambassador entered the hall of mirrors, the sunlight pouring through the tall windows, the floor reflecting the blaze of chandeliers. At the far end, Louis XIV stood, tall, radiant, motionless. No one saw the pain beneath the lace. The two men exchanged pleasantries. The ambassador bowed deeply. Louis nodded with the weary majesty of a man who had spent a lifetime practicing how to look like God. Every step he took during that ceremony was agony. The leg beneath his stockings throbbing, the wound already blackening. Later, the court painters immortalized the event. The old king regal and serene, his pose flawless, his left leg extended just slightly forward in triumph. The irony was cruel. The portrait became famous, celebrated as the final image of Louis XIV in his grandeur, the Sun King standing strong to the end. Yet in truth, the leg so elegantly displayed was already rotting beneath the silk. The black spot had appeared a few days before, small, round, almost harmless looking, like a bruise left by tight shoes. But it deepened with each sunrise, turning purple, then black, the flesh beneath it slowly dying. Gangrene. No one dared speak the word aloud, not at first. To name it was to admit mortality, and at Versailles, death was still considered poor etiquette. The physicians argued quietly in corridors, each one more afraid of being wrong than of losing the king. They applied ointments, bandages, and prayers. They reassured the court that His Majesty's leg ailment was improving, even as the stench began to creep through the room. You might imagine the scene, a grand chamber filled with gold and incense, courtiers fanning themselves with lace handkerchiefs, pretending that the sweet, rotting odor was just another perfume. The infection spread higher, inch by inch. Louis still attended Mass, still forced himself to eat, still smiled at the courtiers who praised his divine endurance. But behind the curtain, the truth was unbearable. Each night, servants found blood on the sheets. His leg had become a battlefield, his flesh the enemy, his pride the only defense left. When the pain became too much, he would close his eyes and whisper prayers under his breath, not to be healed, but to hold his composure. Because even now, at the edge of ruin, he believed that how a king suffered mattered as much as how he lived. He was not the only one performing. Madame de Maintenon sat by the bed, her rosary slipping between her fingers, her face expressionless. She had seen him through decades of grandeur and decay, and now she watched as the man she loved became a relic of himself. The court still came, of course. Nobles visited his bedside, bowing as if to a saint. Doctors shuffled in and out with potions and poultices, each new remedy more desperate than the last, and Louis endured it all with the same quiet stubbornness that had carried him through war, famine, and loss. You, if you were there, might have noticed the strange stillness that settled over the palace. The fountains outside seemed to flow slower. The candles burned lower. Even the air felt hesitant, as though the entire world were waiting for permission to exhale. The Sun King was dying, but no one dared name the sunset. In that August heat, with the gardens wilting outside, Versailles became an echo of its own legend. The palace of light turning dim, the Golden King reduced to a body that could no longer obey its own myth. And yet, even then, Louis refused to surrender the illusion. When asked if he wished to rest, he said, "No, I will die as I have lived, in view of my people." He believed that dignity could outshine decay, that if he stood tall enough, long enough, the darkness would hesitate. But the darkness didn't. It had already started, quiet and patient, beneath his velvet stockings. And from that single black spot, the empire of flesh and illusion began to rot. By the final weeks of August 1715, Versailles had become a hospital, though hospital might be too generous a word. It was more like a laboratory of suffering wrapped in brocade. The smell hit you first. No matter how many candles burned, or how many bowls of potpourri the servants scattered across the room, nothing could disguise the odor seeping from the royal bedchamber. It was the scent of infection, a blend of rot, roses, and panic. Louis XIV was dying, and his doctors were determined to help him do it as professionally as possible. The royal physicians of Versailles were a unique breed, part scientist, part performer, part gambler. They wore powdered wigs, velvet coats, and expressions of deep authority, but their methods came straight out of medieval folklore. Their understanding of anatomy hovered somewhere between astrology and wishful thinking. And so, when confronted with a dying king, they did what doctors of the 17th century always did. They did something loud, something complicated, something guaranteed to make everyone equally uncomfortable. They began, naturally, with bleeding. Out came the silver bowls and the gleaming lancets. A few incisions here, a few ounces of royal blood there. The reasoning was simple. If the body was sick, surely the sickness was floating in the blood. Remove enough of it, and you might remove the disease. In reality, of course, they were draining the last strength from an 80-year-old man who could barely stand. But no one dared say it. As long as the blood flowed, they could claim to be in control. When bleeding failed, they moved on to purging. Out came the laxatives, the tonics, and the warm enemas of milk and herbs, because nothing says divine healing quite like an endless parade of confused apothecaries with buckets. One doctor suggested that the king's humors were unbalanced. Another proposed that his spirit had become clogged. The remedies multiplied: oils, syrups, crushed pearls, powdered deer horn, and something described vaguely as fortifying drops. When that didn't work, they reached for mercury. Because in the 17th century, mercury was the cure for everything: toothaches, syphilis, melancholy, and apparently gangrene. They mixed it into ointments and rubbed it onto the king's blackened leg, watching the skin blister beneath their hands. The smell, according to one witness, was indescribable, and yet they nodded approvingly. "A good sign," they said. "The poison is leaving the body." The only thing leaving the body was the body itself. Still, the doctors persisted. They brought in priests to bless the wound, servants to fan the air, and perfumers to wage their losing war against reality. The courtiers, ever faithful to the illusion, pressed scented handkerchiefs to their faces and whispered how serene His Majesty looked. He didn't look serene. He looked like a man dying slowly in a room full of people pretending it was going well. At one point, desperate for innovation, one physician suggested a cooling application. This involved taking live pigeons, yes, actual pigeons, cutting them open and pressing their still warm bodies against the gangrenous leg. The logic, if you can call it that, was that the life force of the birds would draw out the infection. So there they stood, France's finest minds, elbow deep in feathers and faith, while the king of the most powerful nation in Europe lay motionless, eyes closed, enduring it all without a sound. Because even now, Louis XIV refused to scream. The courtiers were in awe. Priests wept. Doctors congratulated themselves. And all the while, the infection crept higher, blackening the flesh inch by inch. By the end of the week, the leg was nearly gone. But the myth still stood. The Sun King hadn't cried out, hadn't begged for mercy, hadn't broken the performance. His silence became part of the legend, the ultimate act of royal discipline. Meanwhile, the doctors were already arguing over who deserved credit for his recovery. Each wanted to be remembered as the man who cured the uncurable. Each feared being blamed when the inevitable happened. They held endless consultations, speaking in circles around the bed, using words like vapor, temperament, and noxious influence. None of them mentioned gangrene. None of them dared. And outside, the air grew still. The fountains of Versailles, once symbols of eternal vitality, had been turned off to save water. The gardens lay quiet. Even the birds avoided the windows. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final curtain. Inside, the royal chamber had become a grotesque theater. The curtains were drawn tight, the candles flickered, and the audience, courtiers, doctors, priests, sat in reverent dread. The king lay center stage, pale as marble, half-conscious, his body reeking of decay and medicine. He whispered prayers between labored breaths. His confessor assured him that God would forgive his sins. The physicians nodded gravely and applied yet another round of ointments. And through it all, Louis endured. It wasn't courage exactly, not anymore. It was habit. A lifetime of pretending strength had left him incapable of showing pain. He had become his own myth so completely that even death had to play by his rules. You can almost imagine the narrator's sigh here. 17th century medicine was less about healing and more about making everyone equally uncomfortable. They kept him alive longer than anyone expected, though alive is a generous term. Each new treatment left him weaker, each prayer less convincing. The courtiers whispered that he looked peaceful, but peace wasn't the word. It was exhaustion, the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove. And yet, the rituals continued. The bed was surrounded by flowers. The candles were perfumed. The royal musicians played softly in the next room, their notes trembling like the air before a storm. France's greatest king was slipping away, not with the thunder of prophecy, but with the quiet sigh of inevitability. Somewhere, a pigeon cooed outside the window. Alive, indifferent, and far healthier than anyone in that room. And still, the doctors whispered their reassurances, the priests prayed louder, and the courtiers bowed lower, pretending that if they performed the play perfectly enough, the ending might change. But the ending had already begun. The Sun King was fading, and his physicians, armed with feathers, mercury, and optimism, had mistaken the sunset for dawn. By the end of August 1715, Versailles, once the perfume bottle of Europe, had become something else entirely. It was no longer the palace of mirrors or the theater of kingship. It was the palace of stench. No amount of roses, incense, or divine reputation could disguise what was happening in the royal bedchamber. The smell had begun to leak out, first through the curtains, then the corridors, then the very walls themselves. The courtiers called it l'air du roi, the king's air. They meant it as flattery, but everyone knew the truth. The odor was death, blooming beneath silk sheets and holy oil. If you had been there, you would have noticed how people began speaking differently. Short sentences, shallow breaths. They whispered with their mouths barely open, trying to form words without inhaling. Some stuffed handkerchiefs with lavender or vinegar-soaked sponges and pressed them to their faces during audiences. Still, it didn't help. The smell of gangrene is not poetic. It is thick, heavy, almost visible. It crawls along the floor and clings to fabric. It doesn't fade with distance. It follows you. And so, Versailles began to suffocate in its own elegance. Dogs refused to enter the royal chambers. The king's greyhound, usually loyal to a fault, whined outside the door and bolted down the hallway. Servants fainted. Priests prayed faster. Musicians played softer, as though afraid to disturb the air. Every window was opened, but the breeze only carried the stench farther. It slipped under doors, crept through keyholes, and mingled with the scent of candles and polish until the whole palace smelled like mortality disguised as luxury. One ambassador from Spain later wrote that the Sun King is surrounded by an atmosphere of sanctity and corruption, equally thick. The irony was unbearable. This was Versailles, the pinnacle of civilization, the heart of Europe, the golden stage upon which etiquette itself had been invented. Now it was rotting from the inside, and everyone was pretending not to notice. The courtiers still dressed impeccably. They still powdered their wigs and dabbed perfume on their wrists. The women still fluttered their fans, but their eyes darted constantly toward the bedchamber doors, and their smiles were the strained kind worn by people trying not to gag. Louis XIV himself, pale, swollen, wrapped in linen, knew. He could smell it too, but he refused to acknowledge it. He told visitors that the air was too warm, that the candles were to blame, that perhaps a bouquet had wilted, anything but what it was. Because for a man who had spent his life transforming odor into art, perfume, incense, divine aroma, the return of the body's true scent was unthinkable. And yet, there it was. The walls, once perfumed with generations of ceremony, began to absorb it. The odor of decay, seeping into the tapestries, the draperies, the velvet. Every thread of gold embroidery trapped a molecule of rot. Versailles, for all its beauty, had no idea what to do with death. It wasn't built for it. The palace had been designed to reflect sunlight, not extinguish it. Its purpose was to conceal, to polish, to perfume, to disguise the mortal underneath. But death is stubborn. It doesn't respect design. Even the doctors started carrying perfume gloves and small boxes of herbs. Their notes mentioned the unpleasant emanation in the chamber, written in the same tone one might use to describe bad weather. Outside, the courtiers made small talk about the weather, the gardens, the opera, anything but the smell. Diplomats came to offer condolences before the king was even dead, their faces frozen in polite horror. The British ambassador later confessed that he could taste the air, and still the rituals continued. The Sun King insisted on receiving visitors. He sat upright in bed, pale as ivory, his leg bandaged and hidden beneath silks. He greeted ministers, priests, and ambassadors, all of whom bowed deeply while their eyes watered. He smiled through it. The smell didn't humiliate him. It seemed to crown him. In some perverse way, the odor became another symbol of power, proof that even in decay, his body commanded attention. No one could ignore him. You, standing there in that gilded room, might have felt a strange dizziness, not only from the air, but from the surreal contrast. Gold gleaming on every wall, candles flickering over marble floors, the faint notes of music from another chamber. And beneath it all, the undeniable human stench of a king dissolving by degrees. The palace that had once smelled of orange blossom and honeyed wine now smelled like its own undoing. The priests called it holy suffering. The courtiers called it endurance. The doctors called it progress. But deep down, they all knew. This was the smell of an empire too proud to open a window wide enough. And in that suffocating grandeur, the symbolism wrote itself. Versailles, the glittering theater of order and civility, had become a scented tomb. Every candle that flickered against the gold leaf reminded them that light was fragile. Every echo in the marble corridors sounded like a confession. The Sun King's world, so carefully perfumed for 70 years, was now betraying him in the one language no courtier could translate: smell. Outside, autumn was approaching. The gardens, once sculpted into perfect geometry, began to brown around the edges. The fountains, turned off to conserve water, sat still and silent, like mirrors reflecting nothing. And inside, the air thickened with the slow, steady truth of mortality. Madame de Maintenon stopped attending visitors. She prayed beside the bed, rosary clutched tight, her face pale with exhaustion. Servants began washing the corridors daily with vinegar, but the scent only mingled with the decay, sour meeting sweet in an unholy duet. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer. The light refracted weakly through the haze, coating everything in a strange, dreamlike glow, as if Versailles itself were dissolving along with its master. The Sun King, who once believed his scent would perfume eternity, now found himself surrounded by the truest essence of power, what it costs. And the courtiers, ever loyal to the illusion, bowed one last time to the smell of their civilization dying in silk. You might call it tragedy, or maybe justice. Either way, the air remembers. By the last week of August 1715, Versailles no longer felt like a palace. It felt like purgatory. The great mirrors still glittered faintly, but the light that once filled them had turned thin and gray, as if the sun itself were keeping its distance. Servants moved quietly, doctors murmured Latin, and everyone avoided the sound of footsteps, as though noise might invite death to arrive faster. In the royal bedchamber, the Sun King was drifting between worlds. He slept little, and when he did, the dreams came. Sharp, vivid, relentless. He saw soldiers trudging through the snow, bleeding from wounds that never healed. He saw villages burning, mothers clutching children, fields of graves stretching endlessly under a darkened sky. He saw faces, so many faces, some familiar, some forgotten, all staring back at him with the calm of the dead. When he woke, he whispered names no one dared record. The priests called it delirium. The courtiers called it divine visitation. But Louis XIV knew what it was, memory finally catching up. For 70 years, he had lived as if history itself were his creation. Now, history was visiting him in the flesh. Sometimes, in the half-light of evening, he spoke to people who weren't there. His doctors leaned close, thinking he was giving orders, only to realize he was murmuring to ghosts. He saw his old generals, the men who had died for his ambition, standing silently by the window. He saw the Protestants burned under his decree, their smoke rising toward heaven like an accusation. He saw his mistresses, younger than he remembered, their powdered faces soft with reproach. And through it all, the priests prayed louder, trying to drown out whatever it was he was seeing. But prayer doesn't drown guilt. It only gives it rhythm. Madame de Maintenon sat nearby, her rosary moving steadily through her fingers. The sound of the beads was the only constant in the room. Click, pause, sigh, click. She prayed for his peace, for his forgiveness, for her own disbelief, because even she, the woman who had spent years telling him he was God's chosen instrument, could see now that he was dying like any man, afraid, sweating, delirious, and alone. Louis had always believed that confession was for other people. Kings did not confess. They were confessed to. But as the days grew shorter and the pain deepened, his pride began to loosen. He asked for his confessor, the old bishop of Meaux, François Fenelon, long dead. They brought another priest instead, who knelt by the bed and whispered, "Your Majesty, God is listening." The king hesitated. Then he spoke, his voice thin as paper. "I loved war too much." It wasn't a grand speech, no marble-worthy repentance, just a quiet statement, part guilt, part exhaustion. The priest nodded, urging him to continue, and so he did. He confessed the persecution of the Huguenots, how he had ordered their churches destroyed, their families scattered, their faith burned out by decree. He confessed the vanity of Versailles, the endless wars, the mistresses, the pride. But the strangest thing was how calm he sounded. It was less confession than observation, as though he were reading from a ledger he had finally decided to balance. Still, there was panic underneath. When the priest reminded him of divine mercy, Louis whispered, "Even the sun casts a shadow." And that was when the hallucinations returned. That night, witnesses said he reached out toward something invisible, murmuring in a tone both frightened and tender. "I see them," he said softly. "They are coming." "Who, sire?" the priest asked. But Louis didn't answer. He was watching something else, something only he could see. Perhaps the soldiers who'd died for him, or the peasants who'd starved in his name. Perhaps the lovers he'd promised eternity to, all gathered at the edge of the light. The line between memory and haunting had vanished. The priests took turns at his bedside, their murmured prayers filling the room like incense. The psalms, the rosaries, the whispered pleas for divine grace, all rising and falling with the rhythm of his breath. Outside the door, the courtiers waited in silence. Even they, trained to hide emotion, could not ignore the sound of the prayers. It was the sound of a world ending politely. Every few hours, Madame de Maintenon would step out to breathe, pressing a handkerchief to her face, not for the smell, but for the grief. She was losing her faith, and she knew it. The God who had crowned her husband in glory was now letting him rot inch by inch, his once sacred flesh dissolving under the same sun he'd spent his life worshiping. Sometimes she prayed not for him to live, but for him to stop suffering. She'd sit at the window, looking out over the gardens, the fountains stilled, the statues ghostly under moonlight, and think, this is what eternity looks like when it forgets to end. Back inside, the priests grew desperate. They sprinkled holy water on his brow, burned incense to purify the air, whispered louder as if their volume might hasten redemption. But the king's eyes were glassy, his lips barely moving. When he spoke again, it was almost a sigh. "Tell the Dauphin, do not repeat my mistakes." It was the closest thing he ever gave to wisdom or regret. And then, almost to himself, he whispered the words no one would forget. Even my conscience has begun to rot." The priest crossed himself. Madame de Maintenon turned away, her eyes wet. Because for all the divine pomp and heavenly rhetoric, it was the most human thing he'd ever said. It was the sound of a man finally recognizing that beneath the crowns, the lace, the glory, he had been mortal all along. You might almost pity him then, the lonely god in his own creation, surrounded by ghosts of his making, praying not for salvation, but for silence. And yet, even in that silence, Versailles refused to fade. The mirrors still reflected candlelight. The courtiers still whispered titles. The machine of monarchy kept ticking, even as its heartbeat failed. Outside, dawn was breaking, pale and indifferent. The Sun King, for once, didn't rise with it. You've stayed through the ghosts, the prayers, and the confession of a king who finally blinked. So, before the silence closes over him, subscribe, or let his last whisper vanish like the light that made him. September 1st, 1715. After 72 years on the throne, the sun finally set. It happened quietly, which for a man who had lived his life as one long-standing ovation was the cruelest ending of all. At dawn, the palace was already awake. Servants shuffled down the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Priests whispered Latin in the next room. The curtains were drawn tight, and the air hung heavy with the perfume of lilies, wax, and slow decay. The courtiers were there, of course, not out of love, but because etiquette required it. They stood in silence, powdered and perfumed, clutching handkerchiefs to their noses. They had watched this man rule their lives like the rhythm of a clock, and now they were watching him wind down. By this point, the king's body was almost unrecognizable, pale, swollen, and strangely still. His leg, blackened by gangrene, was wrapped in silk. His hands, once the most kissed in Europe, now trembled like old parchment. Every breath rattled. Every exhale felt like it might be the last. He had asked for the candles to be left burning. There were dozens of them, tall, white, flickering along the edges of the bed. They cast soft light over his face, illuminating the hollows of his cheeks and the gold thread on his sheets. The flames wavered when he breathed, as though the room itself were holding its breath with him. Outside, Versailles was unnaturally still. No music, no fountains, no laughter, just silence, thick and reverent, the kind that falls over a theater before the final line is spoken. He had been slipping in and out of consciousness for hours. Sometimes he murmured prayers. Sometimes he simply stared at nothing, his lips moving silently as if in conversation with the invisible. A few servants crossed themselves every time he stirred. Others turned away, terrified of witnessing the exact moment the divine became human. Madame de Maintenon sat beside him, hands folded tightly around her rosary, eyes red from sleeplessness. She had prayed so much she had run out of words. Her God, her king, and her life's purpose were all dissolving in the same bed. One priest leaned close to whisper the final prayers. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. Louis stirred slightly. He looked toward the window, though the curtains were closed, and said softly, I thought it was brighter. Those were not quite his last words, but they were close enough to prophecy, because in that moment, the light in the room dimmed, the candles guttering in the draught, one by one. He spoke again, barely above a whisper. I am going, but the state will remain. And then, finally, silence. No thunder, no chorus, no miracle, just the faint sound of a candle sputtering out. The courtiers bowed their heads. Some wept, others pretended to. A few simply stared, already calculating how soon they could leave before the smell worsened. The priests murmured blessings. The servants dropped to their knees. Madame de Maintenon closed her eyes, and outside the door, someone shouted the ritual phrase, the one they had practiced for generations but never truly meant, "Le roi est mort." Vive le roi. The king is dead. Long live the king. The echo of it traveled down the marble corridors, through the halls of mirrors, across the frozen gardens, until it faded into the early morning air. And with that, the reign of the sun ended, not with fire or triumph, but with the quiet sigh of a man too tired to keep shining. You can picture it, the once golden monarch lying in a pool of candlelight, surrounded by perfumed ghosts of his own making. The room still glittered, the sheets, the gold embroidery, the jewels on the bedposts. But all of it felt wrong now, as though light itself had forgotten how to behave. The courtiers began to file out, one by one. They bowed deeply before leaving, their eyes watering not from grief, but from the air. The smell of death, despite the flowers and incense, was undeniable. Dogs barked outside. Somewhere in the gardens, a fountain sputtered briefly, then stopped again. And the Sun King, the man who had declared himself eternal, lay motionless, his body collapsing into the same quiet flesh he had spent his life pretending to transcend. There's something darkly poetic about it. For 70 years, he made the world revolve around him. When he finally stopped moving, the world hesitated, as if unsure what to do without its orbit. The grumpy historian might say, he died as all kings die, surrounded, yet utterly alone. Because that's the truth of it, isn't it? In the end, no amount of mirrors or marble can reflect you back once the light is gone. No perfume can mask the smell of what you really are. For all the ceremony, the prayers, the diamonds and titles, death still arrived like it always does, uninvited, impatient, and unimpressed. And yet, in that final moment, you almost understand why he believed in his own divinity. He had turned his entire life into theater, and what is death, if not the final scene? The candles flickered, the curtains stirred, and the audience, France itself, waited in the darkness, unsure if the show was truly over. But it was. The sun had set, and no one would ever see its like again. Versailles, still shimmering in the gray light of morning, stood silent, a monument to a man who mistook eternity for perfume and found that both fade faster than you think. Death should have been his curtain call, but for Louis XIV, even the end required choreography. The morning after his death, Versailles awoke to a strange, muted rhythm, the slow shuffle of priests, the scrape of furniture being moved, the distant clatter of silver trays that would never again serve him. The courtiers dressed in black silk moved like shadows, whispering the same thing over and over, "Le roi est mort." But the doctors had work to do. Tradition demanded it, not reverence, but proof. The Sun King could not simply die. He had to be inspected, measured, verified, and divided. France needed to know that its God had been, at least once, human. And so at noon, the surgeons gathered in the royal bedchamber. The candles still burned around the bed, though their flames had grown short and flickering, their wax puddling on the gold-trimmed floor. The smell, already unbearable, had ripened overnight. Perfumed vinegar and incense fought a losing battle against the odor that now saturated everything. Wood, fabric, lungs. The body of Louis XIV lay before them, pale and swollen, dressed in a white shroud. He looked less like a king than a relic, the divine mask stripped away, leaving only skin and consequence. The chief surgeon, Pierre Dionis, took a breath, or tried to, and made the first incision. What came out was not the metaphorical darkness of legend, but the very literal darkness of rot. His flesh was blackened almost to the bone. The stench was so overpowering that several assistants fainted on the spot. One priest pressed a scented cloth to his face and muttered a prayer for strength. The surgeon, with the weary calm of a man who had done this before, continued the work. They opened the chest cavity and found the lungs nearly collapsed, the stomach swollen with infection, and the intestines lined with what the report called corruption. The leg, that infamous battlefield of gangrene, was worse than anyone had imagined, liquefied, consumed, as if the flesh itself had lost the will to exist. The royal heart, however, was declared intact. The doctors noted this with relief, as though the symbol might still redeem the body. But the ritual was far from over. In keeping with royal custom, Louis XIV's corpse was to be divided into 3 sacred relics, one for each kind of devotion the monarchy demanded. The heart would be sent to the Jesuit Church of St. Louis, the entrails to Notre Dame, and the rest of the body, what remained of it, to the royal necropolis at Saint Denis. Even in death, he would not rest whole. He would be shared, displayed, managed. The surgeons began the separation with the same grim precision they had used for his bleeding and purges in life. The body was opened again, organs carefully removed and placed in silver urns engraved with Latin inscriptions. The heart, wrapped in linen soaked in wine, was set aside first, the seat of royal virtue, destined to outlast the rest of him. The entrails, less poetic, were handled briskly. They were salted, perfumed, and packed into a lead container that hissed faintly when sealed. No one prayed over those. The embalming began next. The surgeons filled the empty cavities with herbs, myrrh, rosemary, cloves, and aloe, the ancient formula for masking decay. They poured aromatic resins into the wounds, rubbed the skin with spirits, and wrapped the body in layers of linen soaked in wine and balsam. It didn't help. The smell persisted, creeping through the herbs and oils like a secret refusing to be buried. The Sun King was still rotting, as though determined to remind everyone that divinity had a shelf life. One of the witnesses, trying to sound respectful, wrote, "His Majesty exhaled a final majesty, a fragrance of mortality." It was the politest way anyone had ever described gangrene. As the embalmers worked, courtiers waited outside the chamber, whispering about inheritance and ceremony. None wanted to be near the king now, but all wanted to be seen as loyal. The air outside the door was heavy with gossip and grief in equal measure. Inside, the surgeons completed their work. The body was redressed in regal robes, crimson velvet, gold embroidery, the blue sash of the Order of the Holy Spirit across his chest. The crown was placed at his feet, the scepter beside his hand. But the illusion was gone. The face, waxy and sunken, could not be persuaded into dignity. The mouth hung slightly open, the skin discolored beyond the power of powder or paint. The embalmers closed his eyes and muttered apologies to the silence. By the time the ceremony ended, even the walls seemed to sag with exhaustion. The 3 relics were prepared for transport. The heart, sealed in a crystal urn, was carried out first, escorted by Jesuits chanting solemn hymns. The entrails followed, guarded by priests who moved quickly and said little. The body itself, now reassembled and perfumed, would lie in state for public mourning before its final journey to Saint-Denis. And so it was that France's greatest king, who had spent his life keeping the world orbiting around him, was finally divided into pieces. His heart for piety, his entrails for penance, his body for memory. Even in death, he could not be one man. He was a myth carved into parts, holy, political, and grotesque all at once. You can almost picture it. 3 processions leaving Versailles at dawn, each bearing a different fragment of the same legend. The bells tolling across the countryside, the air thick with incense, the peasants kneeling by the roadside, crossing themselves as the royal relics passed by. And above it all, the sun rising, pale, indifferent, already warming the road that carried a man who once believed it rose for him. For days afterward, the palace still smelled of embalming herbs and death, that stubborn perfume of endings. Servants scrubbed the floors, burned incense in every room, replaced the curtains, but the odor lingered in the walls. It was as though Versailles itself refused to forget. Because how could it? This was the place he built to deny mortality, to perfume eternity, to mirror the divine. And yet even its gold and mirrors could not absorb the truth that had been unwrapped on its marble floors. The Sun King had died, been opened, examined, and portioned like an offering. And the palace that once embodied perfection had watched the illusion rot from the inside out. It was the final irony, and perhaps the most fitting one. Louis XIV had spent his life insisting he was indivisible, the state itself made flesh. And now, that flesh was in 3 different churches, decaying at 3 different speeds. You could almost call it poetic justice, if it didn't smell so bad. In the weeks that followed, France tried its best to pretend that rot could be disguised by ritual. Versailles had been stripped of its usual brilliance, the music silenced, the mirrors shrouded in black velvet, the gardens left untended. But when the time came to bury the Sun King, his court did what it always did best. It performed. The funeral of Louis XIV was not merely a ceremony. It was a theater of obedience, an art form perfected over 70 years of rehearsals. From the dawn of September 9th, 1715, the bells of every church in Paris tolled with relentless precision. They rang so long that people stopped noticing the sound and began to feel it instead. A slow vibration in the bones, a reminder that the divine rhythm of France had faltered. At Saint-Denis, the ancient burial ground of kings, the basilica had been transformed into a spectacle of mourning. Draperies of black and silver velvet cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, embroidered with suns, lilies, and crowns. Thousands of candles burned in the dim air, their smoke mingling with the heavy sweetness of lilies and incense. The scent was almost unbearable, a suffocating blend of holiness and decomposition. If you had been there, you might have found yourself dizzy from it all. The fragrance was thick enough to taste, the flicker of light relentless, and everywhere you looked, you saw contrast, the splendor of monarchy pressed against the simple truth of death. The procession arrived just before noon. The royal coffin, lined in gold cloth and covered with the arms of France, was borne by 12 guards, dressed in mourning black. Behind it came courtiers, bishops, generals, and servants, each holding a candle taller than a man. The glow of thousands of flames shimmered across the marble floor, turning the basilica into something between a cathedral and a fever dream. And above it all, the choir sang, solemn, unearthly, echoing through the arches until even the most cynical noble felt a tremor of awe. The priests began their incantations, their Latin rolling like waves over the crowd. One by one, dignitaries approached the coffin, bowed deeply, and placed offerings, a cross, a crown, a sword, symbols of the power that had outlived its wielder. And then the moment came. The herald stepped forward, his voice trembling not from grief but from ceremony. He called out the ancient words that every witness would remember for the rest of their lives. Le roi est mort, vive le roi. The king is dead, long live the king. The phrase cut through the incense-heavy air like a blade, not a lament, but an instruction, a reminder that the show must go on. Because in France, even death had to bow to continuity. Louis XIV's great-grandson, a boy of 5, was already declared Louis XIV. Somewhere in the palace, courtiers were already rehearsing how to flatter the new rising sun. And yet, the echo lingered. For a long moment, no one moved. The basilica felt suspended between worlds, mourning and celebration, decay and endurance. Then the trumpets began to play, not joyous, not triumphant, something slower, heavier, like the sound of eternity shrugging its shoulders. The crowd swayed under the sound. Thousands of people who had come not only to mourn a king, but to mourn an era. He had been the last man who could make France believe in divine right without laughing. And now, under those arches, surrounded by flowers, candles, and the unbearable sweetness of incense, the illusion was closing, beautifully, tragically, and with perfect lighting. From the gallery, you could see everything. The endless rows of flickering candles reflected in golden candelabra, the smoke twisting upward like ghostly ribbons, the black-draped statues watching silently from the walls. The air shimmered with heat and grief. The royal musicians played softly. Viols, flutes, organs. The same instruments that once filled Versailles with joy, now reduced to a low, trembling hymn. You could almost believe that the king might hear it from wherever he was, tapping his jeweled finger impatiently, wishing they'd chosen something more flattering. The courtiers, ever elegant in their tragedy, dabbed perfumed handkerchiefs at their eyes. The priests recited more prayers than anyone could follow. The crowd of mourners swelled to nearly 2,500 people, nobles, ambassadors, servants, merchants, even peasants who had walked for days to see what eternity looked like. Most of them came for the spectacle. Few came for the man. The coffin was lowered into the vault with excruciating slowness, each creak of the ropes echoing up the stone pillars. The candles wavered in the draft. A few went out. And for the first time in over 70 years, France looked down on its monarch instead of up. When the vault was sealed, the priests chanted the final blessing. The sound reverberated through the basilica, a single phrase repeated until it lost all meaning. Requiescat in pace, may he rest in peace. But peace is a strange thing for a man who never stopped performing. Even in death, Louis XIV was a masterpiece of contradiction, adored and resented, divine and decaying, eternal and forgotten in the same breath. The crowd left the basilica slowly, stepping into the sunlight as though emerging from a dream they weren't sure they'd believed. Outside, Paris was already returning to normal, carriages rattling, vendors shouting, the new king's name being whispered on every street corner. Inside, the basilica remained, half temple, half mausoleum, heavy with flowers and death. The air clung to you as you left, lilies, wax, incense, and something underneath it all that refused to be named, a smell that reminded you of how easily grandeur turns into memory. The same smell that once filled Versailles, now embalming the last illusion, that kings could be more than men. The grumpy historian might have sighed here and said, "He died surrounded by thousands, but mourned by very few." France had lost its sun, but it was too polite to admit that the sky was brighter without him. 78 years after the candles went out in Saint-Denis, France dug them up again. It was October 1793, and Paris no longer bowed to kings. The marble floors of Versailles were cold and empty, its gilded mirrors collecting dust instead of vanity. Outside, the streets belonged to a different kind of crowd, ragged, hungry, and furious. The guillotine was the new altar, and its priests were men in tricolor sashes. They had already executed Louis XVI, the great-grandson of the Sun King, and Queen Marie Antoinette. The monarchy was not just over, it was being exercised. Every remnant of divine right, every symbol of royalty, every crown, tapestry, and statue was being stripped, melted, or burned. But there was one problem left: the dead. The revolutionaries couldn't stand the thought that France's kings still slept in state beneath the Basilica of Saint-Denis, resting peacefully in marble tombs while the living starved in the streets. To them, the crypts weren't holy. They were blasphemy carved in stone, so they decided to open them. On an autumn morning, under a gray Parisian sky, a mob of workers, soldiers, and officials marched to the royal necropolis. Their orders were simple: desecrate, destroy, and bury the monarchy once and for all. The basilica, once echoing with hymns, now rang with the sound of iron bars and boots. The stained glass flickered with torchlight. The air was damp, the kind of cold that clings to your throat. They started with the older kings, the Merovingians, the Capetians, prying open coffins sealed for centuries. Bones crumbled to dust. Skulls rolled onto the floor. The scent of decay, trapped for generations, escaped like a curse. But when they reached him, something changed. The coffin of Louis XIV was heavier than the others, beautifully carved and still gleaming beneath centuries of dust. It took 4 men to lift the lid. When they finally pried it open, they expected a skeleton. Instead, they recoiled. Inside lay a body, not dust, not bone. A body, dark, leathery, disturbingly intact. The blackened flesh clung to the bone, the features still faintly recognizable beneath the ruin. His teeth, his nose, even the trace of a jawline, they were still there. His hair, stiffened by age and resin, clung to his skull like strands of tar. For a moment, the crowd went silent. Even the most skeptical of them hesitated. They stared at the mummified remains of the man who had once ruled Europe, the self-proclaimed Sun King, the embodiment of divine right. The surgeon present noted, almost clinically, that the king's body had been admirably preserved by the strength of the balsams. But the revolutionaries were not surgeons. They were men who had just torn down a throne, and here was the corpse that refused to rot. Whispers spread. Some said it was a sign that the devil himself had preserved his favorite monarch. Others claimed it was proof that the Sun King's vanity had cheated nature. A few even crossed themselves, terrified that he might rise again. One man spat into the coffin and muttered, "Let him rule the worms." Then the hammer fell. They dragged the coffins from their niches, smashed the gilded lids, and stripped the corpses of their trappings. Gold crosses, jeweled buttons, and embroidered shrouds were thrown into heaps. The bones of kings, 13 centuries of monarchy, were carted out into the daylight. Witnesses described the scene as surreal. Carts filled with skeletons rattling down the cobblestones, escorted by laughter, curses, and songs of liberty. The air was thick with the stench of rot and history colliding. Louis XIV, the man who had once declared, "I am the state," was now one of many, tossed into a communal pit outside the basilica, buried under quicklime with the rest of France's former gods. No crown, no incense, no candles, just lime, mud, and silence. The irony was unbearable and perfect. The man who spent his life embalming himself in glory, in perfume, in ceremony, finally met the fate of the peasants he'd taxed to pay for it all. His legacy, once gilded and perfumed, now dissolved in acid and rain. But even then, he refused to disappear completely. The stories persisted, that his corpse had resisted decay, that his heart still pulsed faintly when it was removed, that the ground where they buried him turned black for weeks afterward. The revolutionaries mocked it as superstition, but not all of them laughed. Some swore they felt a strange heaviness in the air that day, as if the basilica itself was watching, waiting. Because if Louis XIV had been anything in life, it was persistent. You can almost imagine him there, under that mass grave, still performing. Not out of pride anymore, but habit. The eternal actor who couldn't quite leave the stage. It's a haunting thought. The revolutionaries thought they were burying monarchy, but what they really buried was illusion. And illusion doesn't rot easily. When the basilica was restored years later, after Napoleon and yet another round of kings, the tombs were rebuilt. The bones of the monarchs, what little could be identified, were reinterred in solemn ceremonies. But no one ever found Louis XIV's remains again with certainty. His body had vanished into the anonymous dust of history. And maybe that was fitting. The man who once divided his body into 3 churches, who turned his life into spectacle, ended up where everyone else does. Unrecognizable, indistinguishable, forgotten by all but the air that remembers the smell. In the end, it wasn't the rot of flesh that doomed him. It was the rot of belief. Because once the idea of divine kingship began to decay, no amount of perfume could save it. The rot spread through France faster than any infection, and by 1793 it had eaten the monarchy whole. The guillotine didn't kill Louis XIV's legacy. It merely confirmed what had already happened. The sun had burned too long, too bright, and left only ash. And if you listen closely to the silence of Saint-Denis or the echoing corridors of Versailles, you might still hear it. The faint crackle of a flame that refuses to die completely, because arrogance, like rot, has its own strange kind of immortality. And so, the story of the sun ends, not with thunder, not with trumpets, but with the sound of a candle sighing in its sleep. Louis XIV, the boy king who once turned France into a mirror of himself, left behind a palace of glass, gold, and ghosts. He built a kingdom out of fear, crowned himself with light, and died in darkness, surrounded by courtiers too polite to breathe. Versailles still stands, of course. The mirrors still shimmer, the fountains still whisper. But if you walk its halls long enough, the illusion starts to crack. Beneath the scent of polished wood and roses, you can still smell what history tried to perfume away. The dampness of bodies, the sweat of obedience, the quiet rot that no monarchy could quite clean. And maybe that's the moral of it all. No matter how bright you burn, the smoke always lingers. Louis XIV believed he was eternal. The truth was simpler. He was human, and therefore temporary. Soap, sunlight, and humility might have saved him more than all the wars, wigs, and incense in the world. Turns out, even the sun needs soap. But don't feel too sorry for him. He wanted to be remembered. And here you are, 3 centuries later, still listening. You've survived Versailles itself, the rot, the perfume, the politics, the pigeons. You've wandered through his corridors of power and watched the light flicker out. And if you stayed awake this long, you've proven something even he couldn't. Endurance without ego. So go on, subscribe. Not because the algorithm demands it, but because somewhere between the marble and the mildew, you've kept history breathing. Every listener who stays until the end rewrites a little piece of what time tries to bury. Let that be your rebellion. Now, close your eyes. Let the candles fade. Imagine the last light glinting off a gilded ceiling and the echo of footsteps finally stopping. May your room smell better than Versailles ever did. And as the silence settles, remember, you didn't just hear a story about decay. You outlasted it.